The religious factor. Religion has been, since time began, a powerful nexus between individuals and groups. Communal solidarity and national unity have often sprung from religious roots. There is no civilization today which does not bear the impress of some religion. The life of the modern secular man is molded by his religious beliefs in more ways than he consciously realizes. In the Orient, religion plays a paramount role, and the following pages will, after some general remarks, describe the impact of religion on the problem of nationalism in India. Religion and nationalism. History proves that religion is an essential element of nationalism and exerts a decisive influence on the national life of a people. One student of nationalism has gone to the extent of laying down that national states are political church organizations, that national consciousness is a religious concept, and that one is a German or an Italian just as one is a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Jew. This is obviously an extreme view, and few political scientists will accept it, even if he is taken to have used the word religion in its widest and most Catholic sense of general belief or philosophy of life. But it is no exaggeration to say that many a nascent nationalism has thriven on a religious background, just as many a religious struggle has won the day by clothing itself in national drapery. In Europe, it was the Reformation, essentially a spiritual stirring of the mind, which ushered in the era of modern national states. One important way in which religion helps nationalism is the supernatural authority that it imparts to the necessity of solidarity. All people must come together, for God wills it, and his mission cannot be accomplished without such unity. In many cases, a reference to divinity has been a potent instrument in wielding a heterogeneous people into a nationality. Religion is also serviceable as a symbol apart from being a sanction of unity. It provides an additional source of pride to the national group. It vouchsafes confidence and courage, particularly when other national bonds lack strength. Numerous examples can be given to illustrate how often religion has molded nationalism and served as a foundation for a nation. Modern Greek nationalism is largely a product of the Greek Church. It was the Orthodox Church which saved the Greeks during the Middle Ages and the early part of the modern age, and finally enabled them to become an independent nation. It was the Kirk which made Scotland a nationality, and it is Calvinism which has made the genius and the character of Scottish nationality. The Roman Catholic Church played an important part in the Spanish Civil War. In Italy, Mussolini could not have succeeded without the friendship of the Church in the colonization of the New Hebrides island. The missionaries of France and England have been potent rivals for the control of the islands. The close tie between religion and nationalism may also be seen in Japanese Shintoism, Jewish Zionism, Irish Catholicism, Indian Hinduism, and Burmese Buddhism. National churches have frequently aroused nationalism, and in a country where different nationalities live side by side, the weaker national group often uses its religion as a defense mechanism. Like Islam in India, Buddhism in Ceylon, and Catholicism in Prussian Poland. Mazzini is a very good example of a leader arousing national fervor through a religious appeal. His soul was permeated with a mixture of religious ethics and national political aspirations. God and the people was his slogan, for to him the nation was a religious concept which he strove to confine within the frame of a political church. Religion also affects national character and habits. Catholic nations exhibit traits different from those of Protestant ones. The impact of Calvinism is different from that of Lutheranism. The Scottish Kirk united the Scots and separated them from the English. Similarly, religion can be a unifying or a dividing factor. depending upon a nation's historical development, where the authority of the national state was firm and strong. As in Holland, England, and Scotland, the religion of the majority of the people became a part of the establishment, thus adding to the unity of the country, where on the contrary, political authority was weak and wavering. As in Germany, no religion attained the privileged position of a national institution, and this heterogeneity worked as a divisive force. Religion also builds up civilizations and molds cultures. French nationalists like Charles Maurras have emphasized and appreciated the role of the Catholic Church in giving to France the glory of which they are justly proud. Some Frenchmen regard only a Catholic as a true compatriot. Similarly, German nationalists extolled Protestantism and attributed to it the greatness of the German nation. Even England, the renowned home of toleration, has not been free of such discriminatory bias. Not many years ago, Dean Ing could write, "It is possible to converse long with a Catholic without being conscious of an insurmountable barrier." And if we consider what this barrier is, we find that we cannot confidently appeal to those instincts and moral traditions which are the common heritage of all English people. 15 years later, H.G. Wells, that disappointed prophet of a new age, rendered this judgment: "You can no more trust a devout Catholic in your household and in your confidence than you can risk frankness or association with a Nazi spy. Never will the devout Catholic be really frank with you. Always there will be a reservation. Always the priest will be lurking in the background. To marry a Catholic is only half a marriage, and your children will be only half your own. And manifestly, if you do business with Catholic shops, if you subscribe to Catholic charities, if you entrust your children to Catholic teachers, you are helping to sustain a hostile campaign against the candid life." In's ideas may be slurred over as the cynicism of the gloomy dean, and Wells' diatribe may be dismissed as misplaced orthodoxy. Anyway, it is open to doubt if such views really reflect English opinion. But what is important in our context is to remember that if such thoughts could be expressed even by a small minority in one of the most homogeneous and sophisticated countries of the world, it is naive to be surprised by the acrimony existing between the Hindus and Muslims in India, particularly if we recall that Hinduism and Islam are, unlike Catholicism and Protestantism, not two species of the same religion, but two distinct creeds with not a single attribute in common. Hinduism and Indian nationalism. The history of India is fundamentally the history of the Hindu people. The earliest Hindu chroniclers of Rajputana referred to their enemies as Asuras, the traditional foes of the Aryan gods, thus indicating the depth of their hatred. The idea of Hindu patriotism was mystical in its conception. The fatherhood was not important. The Mother Earth was deified. The patriotism was a duty towards God and was subordinated to immutable spiritual laws and to the religious ideals. Early Indian nationalism was both religious, Hindu, and racial, anti-British. It was made a religious personification and an incarnation of Krishna. Lord Krishna wrote a nationalist paper. Is our nationalism is a divinely appointed Shakti, ideas power of the eternal. Arya Samaj, one of the earliest modern movements in Hinduism, which soon became a force in politics, opposed Islam with bitterness and Christianity with vigor. The Bengali revolutionary movement of the first decade of the present century had a renascent Hindu ideology as its motive and inspiration, and held up a purified Hindu idealism as a shield against the steady flow of Western influence. It aimed at the expulsion of the British from India and the replacement of the British Raj by a Hindu Raj. At Pune, Tilak founded a society for the removal of obstacles to the Hindu religion, and in his list of such obstacles, the Muslims and the British came on top. The entire outlook of the Congress was Hindu, Swaraj, the Hindu and Congress term for self-government meant Hindu rule. In a book which carried a foreword by Jawaharlal Nehru, a Hindu author wrote, because of this story, the whole country has one idea, one inspiration, one personification of manly virtue. The Hindu character of Indian nationalism is well brought out in S.C. Bose's My Mission of Life, which is a collection of his writings and speeches for the period 1921 to 1929. Throughout this book, he uses Hindu words, invokes Hindu gods, quotes Hindu Shris and thinkers, and in general appeals to Hindu instinct, and at all the time he is discoursing on Indian politics, not on Hindu religion or philosophy. But it is the father of Indian nationalism whose pronouncements and ideas conclusively prove the Hindu nature of Congress politics. Gandhi's greatest contribution to modern anti-colonial political technique was non-violence or satyagraha. He believed it to be an expression of the Hindu philosophy of life. It was, in his own words, the only way to keep Hinduism alive and India undivided, and he preceded mass singing of Ramadan, a Hindu hymn, and the beating of tal, cymbal, are as much a part of discipline in non-violence as physical drill, and training in the use of the arms are that of military discipline. The theory of Satyagraha is an old Hindu concept and was enunciated and elaborated long ago by Patanjali, Ahimsa, which Gandhi made a potent political weapon, was such an integral part of Hinduism that he himself once declared that if it disappears, Hindu religion disappears. Similarly, Gandhi described cow protection as the dearest possession of the Hindu heart, the central fact of Hinduism and the gift of Hinduism to the world. Vande Mataram was, as was said above, a rabidly anti-Muslim song which Indian nationalism had owned. To Gandhi, it had wonderful associations and expressed the one national wish of India, and I should prefer Vande Mataram to Bharat Mata Ki Jai, he said. In 1945, one Shriman Narayan Agrawal published his Gandhian Constitution for Free India, which urged that the Indian constitution should be framed with the background of Indian political thought and tradition, which were mainly contained in the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Kautilya's Artha Shastra, and Shankar Acharya's Nitisara. Drawing upon these purely Hindu sources, Agarwal suggested an outline scheme of constitution. To this book, Gandhi wrote a foreword saying, I regard Principal Agarwal's to be a thoughtful contribution to the many attempts at presenting India with constitutions. The merit of his attempt consists in the fact that he has done what for want of time I have failed to do. Nationalism and religion were thus allied in Gandhi's teachings. He found the substance of India's life in Hinduism. Like Tilak before him, he felt that nationalism needed a spiritual base and provided it from the Hindu dogma. Moral teaching of the Hindu variety went hand in hand with political propaganda, and nationalism was presented in religious raiment. In the political education of the masses, he fully utilized his and their religious background, and therefore, to the majority of Hindus, Hinduism meant Gandhi. By using Hindu terms rather than their rough Western equivalents, he gave a religious color to his political opinions. It was Swaraj, not self-government, that he wanted for India. It was Satyagraha, not non-cooperation, that he commended to the people. It was Ram Rajya, not a golden age, which he set as the goal of Indian nationalism. It was Bharat Mata, not the motherland, to which he bore obedience. It was Ahimsa, not self-control, that he sought to popularize. So he sanctified politics but made it a social version of the Hindu faith. The masses followed him because he was a saint, not because he was a nationalist, though it may be that persistent Congress propaganda had indeed spread the first article of the Congress Creed that an Indian is first a nationalist and only secondly a communalist. In the words of a professor of social anthropology, Gandhi was a Hindu metaphysician, and still it was the Congress claimed that it stood for Hindu Muslim unity. And the Congress regret that Muslims neither joined its ranks nor shared its ideals. When the Muslims refused to have truck with such a nationalism, they were condemned for proclaiming their separateness on the basis of religion. They were said to be a backward, primitive people who still took religion seriously and refused to be modern and secular. Enough evidence has been given above to show that Indian nationalism was as much grounded in Hinduism as was Muslim nationalism in Islam. In fact, the latter was more honest, for it did not pretend to be what it was not. Jinnah made it plain that he was a Muslim, leading only Muslims, and that Islam was the basis of his nationalism. Gandhi said that he was an Indian leading other Indians of all religions and that secularism was the basis of his nationalism. Of the two, Jinnah might have been, in Western eyes, a sectarian, but he was true to his political creed and made no false claims. Gandhi, by claiming to lead all Indians and by condemning the Muslim leadership for uniting religion with politics, exposed himself to the charge of insincerity. On the record of their writings and speeches, Jinnah comes out to be far more liberal and secular than Gandhi. The religious basis of Muslim nationalism will be discussed later when we come to analyze the two nation theory. Hinduism, Islam, and nationalism. Both Hindu and Muslim nationalisms were avowedly based on religion, but it is interesting to find that both Hinduism and Islam are in theory as well as in practice incompatible with the philosophy of nationalism. Hinduism, with its emphasis on caste, encouraged class in consciousness rather than national unity. That explains why in Siam and other Southeast Asian countries it served as a check against the growth of a national idea. In fact, caste system not only deferred the creation of a national spirit but was so anti-national in a sense that it could be justly said that the unity of India had not gone beyond that of the unity of caste. A caste system does not make for that spiritual unity, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which are prerequisites of a healthy national growth. To an orthodox Hindu, the caste is far more than the nation is to other peoples. Under the system, the Brahman enjoyed more privileges as a matter of course than had been arrogated to him itself by any race of conquerors. Feudal nobility or a dynasty ruling by divine right. It was not easy for the high caste nationalist leaders to talk of liberty and equality without renouncing their own privileges defended by sacerdotal sanctions. It was difficult for the masses to appreciate or comprehend the concepts of freedom and independence without enjoying fraternity within their religious circle. Hinduism was inconsistent with either national unity or political democracy, a ruling caste retaining power by force or fraud, holding authority over the masses without consulting them, oppressing them without compunction, and treating them at best as mere means to its own ends, appears to be the political system which alone corresponds to the religion of Hinduism. Historically, Brahmanism had a germ out of which a nationality could take birth, but such hopes had been disappointed. Hindus failed to exploit this reservoir of spiritual leadership, which might have, in the course of time, laid the foundations of a semblance of national unity. Muslim invasion was not successfully resisted, and for many centuries the Hindus act out a far from happy existence as a subject people. The rise of the Maratha power in the 18th century was the last opportunity when the Hindu force might have assured the rise of a national spirit. But Brahmanism did not pass into patriotism, and Shivaji's movement remained as an organization of plunder. It was only in the beginning of the present century that Hinduism experienced a stirring in its body politic and began to dream the dreams of an Indian nation. By then, however, it was too late, for the Muslims too had awakened to their plight. In consequence, when national regeneration finally came to India, it produced two nationalisms instead of one. Curiously enough, Islam too is anti-national in theory. In traditional Islamic view, states are not based on nationhood. All the Muslims in the world are supposed to belong to one big society. Call it nation or millat or what you will. Till the present century, many national groups lived in one state, and in modern parlance, we may say that most Muslim states were multinational. For many years during the last quarter of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, the Hindus believed in territorial nationalism. They had their roots in India, which was their own country. Nationalism, a Western concept, was borrowed and quickly made the basis of their struggle for independence. The Muslims, however, tenaciously clung to their traditional idea and refused to face the problem of nationalism posed by special Indian conditions. Iqbal still sang of Hindustan Hamara, India as our land, and few Muslim leaders or thinkers referred to the Muslims as a national group. It was much later, during the 1930s, that territorial nationalism began to intrude into their political thinking. Geography entered into their political calculations for the first time, and the idea of a separate state began to take shape in their mind. Even then, the orthodox or ulama class denied the validity of the concept of territorial nationalism. They said it was un Islamic, and by the logic of traditional dogma, they were right. Their opposition to the idea of an Indian Muslim nationalism was and could be interpreted as their alliance with the Congress and the Hindus. In political terms, this interpretation was justified by the maxim that anyone who is not with us is with them. But it's quite possible that the nationalist or pro-Congress Muslims decried the Pakistan idea not because they were anti-Muslims but because they were orthodox Muslims for whom the association of territory with nationalism went counter to Islamic beliefs and traditions. Abul Ala Maududi's writings furnish the best modern argument against the concept of nationalism in Islam. His chief objection to the policy of the Muslim League and to the idea of Pakistan was that they were based on the theory of nationalism, which he held to be incompatible with Islam. He argued thus, nationalism is not only a wrong way of thinking, but is the real cause of all those disasters which have overwhelmed the world. Nationalism means selfishness, blind prejudice, and cruel pride. To believe in modern nationalism is to turn our backs on the Quran. To demand a state on this basis is to rebel against the teachings of Islam. The spirit of Islam, which you profess to believe and from which you derive the name Muslim, is in conflict with the spirit of this dirty and rotten system. Muslim nationalism is a contradictory a term as caste prostitute. Till 1947, he maintained that he would not fight for Pakistan, that he did not believe in Pakistan, and that the demand for it was un-Islamic. Maududi was not plugging a lonely furrow. Most of the ulama and nearly all the orthodox Islamic parties were with him rather than with Jinnah. Appeal to Islam was an instrument of extraordinary potency, and this vastly increased the difficulties of the exponents of Muslim nationalism. They had to fight on three formidable fronts: to persuade the British of their separate entity, to convince the Hindus of their determination to live apart, and above all, to nullify the efforts of the anti-nationalist forces within themselves. So far, we have been discussing the theoretical position, but in practice too, There were strong factors which retarded the growth of nationalism and impeded the work of Muslim nationalists. One was the lack of education among the Muslim community. It is a commonplace that democracy cannot work without education. But we are prone to underrate the importance of education in the growth of a national spirit. The national creed cannot be propagated without a minimal level of education among the people. Muslims lagged far behind the Hindus in this field. They lacked schools and universities. They had practically no journals and publishing houses. To preach nationalism is to put across facts and arguments, a process well nigh impossible without well informed leaders and educated masses. The fact of the rapid growth of Hindu nationalism is largely due to the advance made by Hindus in the sphere of education. Sayyid Ahmad Khan's emphasis on education appears in retrospect in a new light. Besides the obvious and immediate need of preparing Muslims for public services, his educational policy also helped to spread education among the masses and thus to facilitate the work of the leaders who came after him. Another factor of equal consequence was the low status of women in Muslim society. The orthodox section appealed to Islam as an argument against female emancipation. Maududi still denies a franchise to women. The moderately educated section was also reluctant to raise the position of women. Most parents did not send their daughters to school. To let the women enter the profession was a revolutionary step which few dared to take. With nearly half the total population thus disqualified and immobilized, the spread of the national message inevitably suffered. One undesirable result of Hindu impact on Indian Islam was that many Muslims borrowed the caste system and practiced it almost as severely as the Hindus. Islam, which had brought the message of equality and fraternity to India, became itself a divided house. Caste and subcaste maintained their separate status. Intercaste marriages were uncommon. In politics and in the pursuit of national unity, this proved a crippling handicap. Finally, the Muslim community in India was a very conservative body of opinion. The influence of orthodox Islamic teaching killed the spirit of free inquiry. The ulama did not hesitate to invoke the sanction of religion in favor of the status quo. In 1934, for example, opinion in Multan ruled that compulsory primary education was an interference with religion and contrary to Sharia. Some of the most highly educated persons were biased against independent research and inquiry. Sir Muhammad Iqbal thought that Sir T. W. Arnold's The Preaching of Islam was not a reliable book because Arnold had nothing to do with Islam and because all his scholarly work had been done in the interest of England. Similarly, he believed that Professor Brown's A Literary History of Persia was written to advance the English interest so that by emphasizing Persian nationalism, the unity of Islamic millet could be broken. Islam was interpreted in the narrowest possible terms, and religion was made a dogma and a ritual rather than a pathway to God. Free thinking was discouraged, feudalism was rampant, and the landlord class provided the bulk of the leadership. Jinnah was a first front rank leader who did not belong to the landed aristocracy. Thus, the spirit of conservatism was strong, and those who spoke of a wind of change spoke in vain. Muslim India produced no philosopher and no social thinker who could, by sheer force of his ideas, change the course of Muslim thought. The society was static intellectually and mentally, and the deadening hand of reaction held all progressive forces in check. This was hardly congenial soil for the seed of nationalism, and the seed sown by earlier leaders might probably never have sprouted had political events of the 1930s not shocked the Muslims into a realization that any further inaction would spell certain disasters. The Khilafat movement. Nothing illustrates the play of religious feeling in politics better than the short lived but fervent Indian Khilafat movement. The Ottoman Empire has figured prominently in British foreign policy on what has gone down in British history as the Eastern Question. English sympathies were first given to Turkey for two politico strategic reasons. Russia posed a threat to British imperial stakes in Asia, and therefore a friendly Turkish empire was a British interest. The safeguarding of the Indian Empire became another element in the formation of British attitude towards Turkey. Palmerston was notoriously pro-Turkish and anti-Russian, and the Crimean War was fought to protect the integrity of Turkey and to hedge in the expansion of Russia in the east. With Disraeli, this policy did not change, for he too thought it to be in the British imperial interest that Turkey should be strong. With the coming of Gladstone, this policy was forsaken. Britain was now more interested in the future of Armenia. Turkey was no longer a country to be wooed and won, but an Asiatic intruder in Europe to be kept in its place. How could a Muslim power maintain itself in Europe? The Ottoman Empire was an outdated theocracy, which had no further use for British diplomacy. The earlier it was liquidated, the better it would be for Europe and Christendom. Here it is relevant to recall that this anti-Turkish feeling coincided with the then current theory that the Indian mutiny was the handiwork of the Muslims. This added a bitter edge to British opinion. Had Britain come to the defense of the Turks and saved them from the Russian invader so that their co-religionists in India could rise against the British in revolt? Was this the reward of a traditional pro-Turkish policy? Still another complication arose in the already tangled web. The Sultan of Turkey was not only the head of the Ottoman Empire but also the Khalifa of the world community of Islam. It is true that Khilafat was purely Sunni institution and the Shias did not acknowledge the supreme religious status of the Khalifa. But he was also the head of the only surviving Muslim empire, and this aspect of his position appealed equally to the Sunnis and the Shias. On the Khilafat question, therefore, all the Indian Muslims were combined against the British. The Khalifa's powers must be maintained. The Ottoman Empire must be retained. European designs aimed at the dismemberment of Turkish territories were resented in India and gave birth to what came to be called the Khilafat movement. This movement had obvious religious basis. The Muslim concern for the Khalifa was apparently an Islamic sentiment. To this was added the general feeling that European powers were fastening upon Muslim states in North Africa and the Middle East. Russian advance in Turkestan, French control of northern Africa, British intervention in the Persia and Afghan affairs, Italian occupation of Tripoli, all this was in Muslim eyes an unmistakable and deliberate plan to destroy Islam in the world. Then came the Turco-Italian conflict and the Balkan Wars, in which Britain did not come to the rescue of Turkey as Muslim India had expected it to do. With the coming of the Great War, matters were made infinitely worse by Turkey joining the Central Powers against Britain and her allies. When Turkey fought against Britain, the Indian army fought for Britain and therefore against Turkey. As the Indian army counted a great number of Muslims in its ranks, the situation was indeed grave. But the old habit of loyalty reasserted itself. Confidence in the British sense of fairness overcame Muslim suspicions and doubts, and therefore Muslim India took her full share in the war effort. The explosion came at the end of the hostilities when a peace treaty with the vanquished Ottoman Empire was being negotiated. Muslims were beginning to take a rosy view of the future of Turkey. They had close affinity with Turkey on religious grounds. They were also, mentally speaking, not far removed from Britain. They looked forward to an amicable settlement of the problem with matters turning out in favor of Turkey. Lloyd George's declaration that Britain was not fighting to deprive Turkey of its territorial integrity held out a hopeful chance. But the Treaty of Sevres, which the Allies signed with Turkey on 10 August 1920, dashed the hopes of Muslim India. The treaty took away large slices of Ottoman territory, eastern Thrace, Gallipoli, Smyrna, the Straits, and Dardanelles, the Aegean Islands, and distributed them among the victors of war. Muslims reminded Lloyd George of his promises and of Muslim loyalty, but to no effect. They were rapidly losing their patience as well as their trust in British pledges. They believed that the peace conference was bent on the destruction of Islam. Much excitement prevailed and a seething restlessness took hold of Muslim politics. An All India Khilafat Committee had been formed a little earlier, and one of its first actions was a call to the people issued on 23 November 1919. As a religious edict to abstain from participation in victory celebrations, to boycott British goods, and to non-cooperate with the government on 24 June 1920. 90 prominent Muslims wrote to the Viceroy that they would refuse to cooperate with the government from 1 August unless in the meantime the terms of the peace treaty with Turkey were revised. One Muslim leader bitterly remarked that Muslims now consider the British as the enemy of Islam, since they had seen how, for the sake of Greek imperialism, Jewish capitalism, and the oil fields of Mesopotamia, their cherished sentiments had been deliberately assaulted. This had shattered their faith in constitutional methods and created the danger of India becoming Ireland on a huge scale. Lord Northcliffe, while on a world tour in January 1922, was deeply struck by the depth of the anti-British sentiment among the Muslims of all countries. He found the Indian situation much uglier than the British press appeared to make out, and warned that peace could not be assured until the Muslim question was adjusted. His paper told the British to stop thinking of the Khilafat agitation as engineered and fictitious and to accept the fact that Indian Muslims suspected the Lloyd George administration of an anti-Islamic bias. Lord Reading, the new viceroy, was sympathetic to the Muslim feeling, and early in 1922 he sent a telegram to Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, urging the government to concede the basic Muslim demands. Montagu sanctioned the publication of this dispatch without consulting the Prime Minister and for this was asked to resign. In India, of course, this enforced departure of a friendly Secretary of State was interpreted as another proof of Lloyd George's perfidy. Muslim leaders appreciated Montagu's friendliness and condemned the Prime Minister's action. 20 Muslim members of the Indian Legislative Assembly wired to Lloyd George their emphatic protest against his deplorable action, the appreciation of Montagu's efforts in the cause of Khilafat, and their conviction that he was sacrificing the anti-Khilafat cause. The Muslim belief hardened that the government of India was favorable to Turkish claims, but it was the British government which was the protagonist of the anti-Turkish campaign. In Turkey, in the meantime, important developments were taking place. By diplomatic skill supported by the might of arms, Mustafa Kemal beat the Greeks out of Turkey, shot the unity of the Allies to ribbons, and forced Britain to draft a revised treaty. The Treaty of Lausanne was accordingly signed in July 1923. In India, the most remarkable development was the Hindu-Muslim entente. On the question of the Khilafat, Gandhi, on behalf of the Hindus, had pledged his support to the Muslims in their anti-British and pro-Turkish movement. The formidable Hindu-Muslim alliance had two immediate results. One was the final victory of the Khilafat agitation, clinched by the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne. Another was a joint front formed by the Congress and the Muslim League during the making of the 1919 reforms. But in the long run, as we will see, this marriage of convenience was unproductive of any permanent results. In 1921, a correspondent of the Times had lamented that Muslims were joining hands with the hereditary enemies of British Raj, the Hindus. Through the misdoings of our own government, in 1923, the same journal was publishing gory details of widespread Hindu-Muslim riots. Two final questions remain to be answered. What lay behind the Khilafat movement? What permanent impress did it leave on Indian politics and especially on the growth of Muslim nationalism? The Muslims looked at the maintenance of the Sultan as a great honor to Islam and keenly resented the process of cutting up the only great Muslim power and dividing it into nations or petty republics. They felt that by their sentimental sympathy with the Oriental Christians and the Greeks, the British were forgetting the history of Muslim loyalty in India. They pointed out that Turkey had been, unlike Germany and Austria-Hungary, denied the right of self-determination. They looked unkindly at British encouragement to the Arabs to rise against Turkey and at British support to Zionism in Palestine. In their eyes, the British, by their treatment of the Turks, had made it evident that they refused to Muslims a fair chance of progress and would not let Islam revive. Islam was being looked upon as a dying religion, and the agitation was being branded as a silly and insincere pretext. To prove that this was wrong, Muslims of all shades of opinions joined together in support of the movement. The movement was fundamentally religious. Though it had a strong political undercurrent, the Muslims were not prepared to see any diminution of the powers of the Khalifa, nor were they ready to countenance even the shade of a British or European control over the holy places in Arabia. Altogether, it was religion which determined the shape and content of the movement and which, for the first time, brought all the Muslims of India on one platform. Whether the movement was a mere interlude, brief and pointless, in the history of Muslim India or an important milestone in the train of events is a moot question. On the credit side, several things can be mentioned. It trained the Muslims in political action and agitation. For the first time, a definite plan of action was drawn up and executed. It also brought the extremists and the moderates on one platform, or at least brought a unity to their outlook and taught them how to work in unison. There was nothing in common between, say, the Aga Khan and Maulana Muhammad Ali, or between Sayyid Amir Ali and Dr. M.A. Ansari. But the loyalists and the agitators worked to the same end. Whether the rebels were bringing out processions in India or the constitutionalists were writing to the Times in Britain, the aim was identical. Never again was the synchronization of political action in India with publicity in Britain to be achieved. The Khilafat movement also destroyed the myth of Muslim loyalty. The spectacle of the agitating Muslim was such a break with their traditional conduct that at first the British rubbed their eyes and refused to believe what they saw. The friends of yesterday had become the enemies of today. Whether this metamorphosis was caused by the exigencies of British foreign policy or by an inherent Muslim enmity of Islam is irrelevant. The net result was that the mutual trust, carefully nurtured by the efforts of 40 years, was gone, and with it the old method of conducting politics. This change was also due to Hindu-Muslim unity, which lasted just as long as the Khilafat issue was in the forefront. Gandhi had thrown himself wholeheartedly into the fray because, as he confessed, it was an opportunity of uniting the two peoples which might never recur. The Muslims welcomed this reinforcement, for it swelled the ranks of the agitators and brightened the chances of success. This alliance was a new phenomenon in Indian history and created false hopes in countless press. However, this unity did not last long. Even before the final battle was won, cracks had begun to appear in the entente. For the discerning observer, there were signs of the things to come in this rift. Many Muslims learned one important lesson, that Hindu-Muslim differences were too deep to be bridged over by passionate professions of friendship and even by united action in the political field. The movement in effect underlined the basic Hindu-Muslim schism, which nothing could heal. Never again were the two communities to combine forces against the British. The movement also threw up some effective leaders among the Muslims, effective but not really of the first class. As the movement was highly emotional, it was easier for the fire eating demagogue to get himself lionized than for the cautious constitutionalist to catch the public eye. There was no Fazl Hussain or Jinnah among its leaders, only the Ali brothers Azad and Ansari. By definition, the movement was religious and anti-British. Therefore, by definition, it excluded the westernized and cooperative public man from its ranks. The need of the movement, the need of the moment was to rouse popular emotions to snapping point to make fighting speechless, to scare the British, to preach sedition even to the soldiers, to issue threatening statements promising dire consequences, and, if necessary, to go to jail to prove one's love for Islam. Only a special kind of leadership was capable of this, and it ruled the roost. Within these limitations and in their own province of activity, the Khilafat leaders were good tacticians and competent politicians. They rarely looked beyond the movement and had no vision of the future. But they were all sincere men, passionately attached to the religion and fanatically devoted to the welfare of Turkey. As long as the campaign lasted, they rode on the crest of the wave of popular acclaim. There was no end to what the masses were ready to do at their bidding. But when the emergency passed away, a calm resembling death settled upon Muslim India. New problems arose which the old leadership had not anticipated, and for which they had no solution. For a time, in fact, for the next 8 years, politics were static and the masses confounded. It is in the sense that the Khilafat leadership was a failure and the movement itself a pointless interlude. One would have thought that the success of the Khilafat movement would teach the Muslims one elementary lesson, that in unity lies strength. A joint effort had led them to victory, and in future too they should seek their appointed goal in unity. But no sooner had the movement come to an end than the Muslims were once again divided into nationalists and leaguers, extremists and moderates, pro-separate electorate and anti-separate electorate. It seems that it is only in moments of dire danger that Muslims can stand shoulder to shoulder and defy the common foe. This has been proved again and again in Muslim political history all over the world. Religion was the raison d'etre of the Khilafat movement, and this had one important result for the subsequent growth of the Muslim nationalism. By emphasizing Islam, the movement made the Muslims conscious of their being Muslims. Of course, the feeling of being a separate religious group was at least as old as the time of Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Later, the demand for separate representation was also based on the claim that their religion set them apart from other Indians. But it was only now that they felt with unprecedented intensity that they were Muslims first and Indians afterwards. This was a triumph for Muslim nationalism, for it proved a base on which other unities could be built. And this, as far as we can see, was the only permanent contribution of the Khilafat movement to the larger problem of nationalism. It was a contribution, however, which no historian can afford to underestimate or ignore. Pan-Islamism. It was Jamaluddin Afghani who first preached the doctrine of Pan-Islamism. Broadly, the doctrine was that Muslims all over the world were brothers to one another and should unite in defense against the influence working against Islam. Later, Sultan Abdul Hamid of Turkey propagated the theory partly out of genuine conviction, but largely out of the necessity of bolstering up his position as the Khalifa of the Islamic world. In his mouth it took the shape of an appeal to the faithful to rally round the Ottoman throne. Still later, the Turkish Committee of Union and Progress took up the cause of Pan-Islamism and spread its message to all Muslim lands. Pan Islamism was in the main a sentiment, a slogan, and it is extremely doubtful if it ever inspired the various Muslim countries or peoples to gang up against what they considered to be the enemies of Islam. Under its influence, the Muslim League passed resolutions against the British policy of leaving Turkey to its fate during and after the Balkan Wars of instigating the Arab revolt against Turkish rule. A modicum of pan Islamic feeling was certainly behind the Khilafat movement, but it never became a plan of action. At the most, it signified a desire to see the Muslims of the world standing shoulder to shoulder and sharing one another's adversities and triumphs. In India, the doctrine had a slightly stronger appeal than in other countries because the Muslims were in a minority. They insisted on the international aspect of Islam, but in this, their motive force was the defensive attitude in the face of Hindu nationalism. To them, the need for unity was greater because their security was in greater danger. They needed help from their co religionists in their flight from the peril of Hindu domination. But many in Britain refused to see Pan Islamism in this light. They espied in it a potent danger to British world interest. Sir Ronald Storrs, who, with Sir Henry McMahon, had played a major part in negotiations with the Arabs, lamented that the Treaty of Lausanne had been in part dictated by the British Foreign Office fear of this well known and discredited pan Islamic bluff. Islam was a creed of narrow dogmatism and fanaticism, and pan Islamism boded no good to humanity. There was also the apprehension that Islam, being a conquering creed, a strong Muslim military power, might make pan Islamism a dangerous reality. This misgiving was also behind the Manchester Guardian's opposition to the entry of Turkey into Thrace, for it would mean the re entry of the effective military power of Turkey into Europe. On the other hand, it could be argued that pan Islamism had been reawakened and regenerated from its long democracy by the Christians themselves, and not by Muslim thinkers and rulers. Egypt was held by Britain, Algiers and Tunis were ruled by France. Morocco was next on the French list of her colonial possessions. Tripoli had been earmarked for Italy, and the Ottoman Turks were being slowly but resolutely rolled out of Europe. It looked like a relentless Christian crusade against the Muslim world. Was it then if Muslims all over the world were closing their ranks for common defense against Christian aggression? Pan Islamism might or might have not have affected the Muslim nationalist movement in India, but on the whole it appeared to be more of a liability than an asset. It earned the Muslims considerable European hostility without receiving any succor from Muslim countries. It alienated many British commentators of weight and created an unnecessary barrier between them and their understanding of Muslim India's problems. It also frightened some Hindus and made them suspect the Muslims of imperialist designs. Many Hindus who should have known better sincerely believed that Muslims are planning, in cooperation with their co-religionists from across the border, to crush Hindu India and to refound a Muslim empire, at least in the north. The Modern Review, an influential Hindu journal edited by B.C. Chatterjee, propagated for many years the idea that a Muslim attack from the north was inevitably in case of British withdrawal. Even a liberal politician like Sir Albion Rajkumar Banerjee gave currency to the idea that Indian Muslim nationalism would one day result in pan-Islamism and an Islamic empire. This fear was genuinely held in some responsible quarters and is said to have played a considerable part behind the scenes at the Round Table Conference. In later years, the Pakistan demand was opposed by the Hindus for, among other things, its alleged pan-Islamic tendencies. Once Pakistan came into being, the argument ran, India would be confronted with a hostile and aggressive Muslim bloc extending from Lahore to Constantinople. The Christian view of Muslim nationalism. It must not be forgotten that some in Britain looked at British imperialism as a convenient instrument for advancing Christianity. This was particularly true of India, which some British administrators and their friends in England took to be a battleground for the rivalry of Christianity and Islam. Even Muslim loyalty could not, especially in the early years, drive out this impression. Herbert Edwards wanted to have nothing to do with Islam or Hinduism and to teach from the Bible in all schools. He was convinced that the only way to keep the Indian Empire and defer the danger of internal rebellion was to open the Bible wide and teach the Indians the Christian view of life. In 1860, 2049 petitions were presented to the Parliament for the admission of the Bible into all schools and colleges in India. It was believed that by refusing to proselytize in favor of Christianity and by imparting secular education, the government was creating among the Indian students a tendency to general infidelity and bringing about a negation of God in his practical life. This was morally poisonous and politically dangerous. The British should teach dogmatically and firmly in all government schools the great fact of God's existence and a supreme moral government of the world, implying the ultimate and absolute responsibility of every human being to his omnipotent jurisdiction. The fact that Christianity had made no impression on Islam was regretted. Some British teachers and priests openly favored Christianity, and when the conflict was between Hinduism and Islam, sided with Hinduism. Professor Monier Williams, for example, regarded Hinduism as the natural religion of humanity and Islam as an illegitimate child of Judaism. The teachings of the Quran tended to make the Muslims more intolerant, more sensual and inferior in moral tone to the Hindus. To him, Christianity had more points of contact with Hinduism than with Jainism, Buddhism, or even Islam. Sir William Moore, the biographer of the Prophet, held that the sword of Muhammad and the Quran were the most stubborn enemies of civilization, liberty, and truth, which the world had yet known. Islam was a strange travesty of Christianity. It was far more hostile to Britain than was Hinduism. Guy Hardy warned the English people against the day when all Muslims of the world take it into their heads to try once again to win supreme power for Allah in the East. It was unpardonable for Britain to allow the Turks to kill Greeks and Armenians to please the Muslims of India. This only gained her a reputation among Christian nations for gerrymandering European frontiers in response to Asiatic Muslim opinion. It is a curious fact that in the context of Indian politics, nearly all Christian missionaries and other in holy orders were partial to the Hindus and the Congress. Many names spring to mind: Malcolm McCall, John Morrison, Murray Titus, C.F. Andrews, J.Z. Hodge, W.W. Cash, G.E. Hickman, Johnson, and others. Even the Quakers, actually professing a priestless religion, always sided with the Congress with Horace Alexander and Reginald Reynolds. What explains this? One answer may be that both Christianity and Islam were proselytizing religions, while Hinduism was not. So, in the purely religious field, the conflict was between the two imported creeds, not between Christianity and Hinduism. Another reason may have been, as has been described above, the usual Christian hostility to pan-Islamism, which was sometimes made out to be the inspiration of all Indian Muslim political moves. It was even suggested that the only effective remedy of the perennial Hindu-Muslim conflict was the Christian Church. If all India was converted to Christianity, there would be no communal problem in the country. This Christian attitude, which was by no means typical of British opinion, had three consequences. For Muslim nationalism, first, this unsolicited hostility sometimes adversely affected the spirit of Muslim loyalty and came in handy to the extremists in enlisting fresh recruits to their ranks. Secondly, by sheer reaction, it consolidated the Muslim community. If some Englishmen were thinking of the problem in religious terms, Muslims must be Muslims and in self defense, even fanatics. Thirdly, it furnished a minor vicarious example of divide and rule. Christians distinguished between Hindus and Muslims and supported one of the parties. This might have tended to throw the Muslims even farther apart from the Hindus than they actually were. On the whole, the role of the missionaries and their friends at home put the Muslims on defensive and made them more conservative than they ought to have been. It also quickened their nationalism by making them close their ranks.